Hello, and welcome to our Power of Product Data series, episode 5, the Power and Peril of Global Attributes. I am Chantal Schweizer, Principal Taxonomist with Early Information Science, and joining me, as always, is our Director of Delivery, Jason Hine. How are you today, Jason?
I'm fantastic, Chantal. Super excited to talk about this problem. Nobody talks about it, but it's been a thorn in my side in too many projects. So let's nip it in the bud for everybody who's attending.
Very true. So today's 15-minute segment, well, let me get to this slide. Here we go. This 15-minute segment, we're going to switch gears a bit. We've been talking a lot about taxonomy in our 15-minute sessions, and today we're going to focus a little bit more on attributes, specifically global attributes. What are global attributes? What are the benefits and risks of global attributes? When you should and shouldn't use them? And what are the best practices and next steps to make sure that you're using them appropriately? But first, we would like you to take a poll. We would like to know where you are in your journey. Let me get that started. And are you at the beginning and you're still trying to figure out where you're going, or do you have a plan and budget and team in place and you're raring to go? Please let us know. We'd very much like to know you better.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, so let's dive on in. Let's start with our global versus category attributes. Jason, what can you tell us about the difference between global and category attributes?
What are global attributes? So it's actually a very simple kind of binary rule. So a global attribute is an attribute that applies to every single product in every single category that you sell. It is, and because these are universal attributes, what we kind of a common smell test to use in terms of assessing whether an attribute is global is really to look at, is this an attribute that is in your default ERP system? A lot of the attributes that kind of come out of the box with ERPs are attributes that are logistical in nature. It's talking about how you're going to sell the widget, how you're going to ship the widget, how you're going to, talk about the widget. They're not necessarily describing things that are inherent in the product. It's about how you sell it. Now, the flip side of that is basically anything that doesn't meet that smell test is what we call a category attribute. Now, that's not to say that this attribute applies only to one category. There are category attributes that may apply to 50% of what you sell. But if it's not universal, then it's not global, and you shouldn't be treating it as global. These are attributes are usually the ones that actually are talking about the product itself, that are describing the inherent features, the inherent qualities. That makes them actually fairly useful for things like faceted search once you get into a particular category.
All right, very good. So what can you tell us about the temptations and dangers of global attributes?
Well, yeah. So because they are universal, it can be very tempting as an organization to say, hey, you know what? Designing attributes is so hard. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be smart, and I'm going to set up every one of my attributes as global, because that way I don't need to worry about having my product experts set up the attribution, because my suppliers or the people who are going to be giving me this data are the ones who are going to make the decision about whether or not it's relevant. So it makes it, the nice thing about global attributes as a default is it does make it pretty flexible. You can load any attribute for any SKU that you load into your selection. And theoretically then, if you do that well, then from a governance perspective, the great thing about global attributes is you write one set of business rules for governance, and then the tools that you have can check everything that you carry. But in reality, this works better in theory than it does in the real world. And Chantal, you've seen this when you've gone into client problems or client projects. What do you see in terms of the kinds of problems this actually creates?
So we definitely see this with clients all the time, where they have defaulted to using global for most of their attribution. So we're called in to detangle the mass of global attribution into a more category managed set of schemas so that it's a much more efficient in use. So when you default to global, you're going to see a lot of empty attributes, a lot of NAs, a lot of nulls for all of the attributes that aren't applicable for that specific product. And then that causes issues with being able to measure your data and your appropriate data fill. And then your database is going to become strained. If you have hundreds of attributes for all of your products and so many of them are just filled in with a plain old NA, then that's a lot of space that is unnecessary, and that additional space needs to be maintained and will eventually strain your database. And then last but not least, your channel partners. So the people who are supplying you with data, at first they're going to want to be really successful and they're going to want to fill in as much as possible. And they're going to make assumptions on some of those attributes and possibly fill them in incorrectly. There might be duplicate fills, but then eventually they're going to get tired and they're not going to want to fill in all this data, and the data is going to get less accurate, less filled in, and less useful.
Yeah, what starts off as a goal to try to take work off of yourself in the population ends up actually being more work for yourself in global, because your suppliers eventually are going to get wise and say, honestly, I'm spending a lot of time on attributes that aren't relevant, and that can the last thing that you want in setting up an e-commerce or a digital transformation is channel partners who are frustrated with or tired of your effort. That's
very, very true. We all want to work together happily.
Amen.
So then let's take a look at what are good and not so good examples of global attributes. If we start with our good global attributes, our appropriate global attributes, we see some examples like the brand name, country of origin, manufacturer name, tax ID, hazmat, shipping status, and we see these are often standard, and they are set with rules by external groups, like tax ID might be set by the government. And then the other ones are necessary for operational and transportation capabilities, like hazmat and shipping weight. So it's really necessary for all the products to have these appropriately filled in, because these are applicable to all the products so they can be sold. But then let's look at our inappropriate global attributes. What can you tell us about those, Jason?
Right. So unlike what we've talked about as appropriate, where it's set by a third party, a lot of the attributes that we see clients try to use as global and fail are when these are attributes that are oftentimes defined by the way that you as a company, you as a firm want to use it. And they fall into three kinds of buckets. The first few here you see style, item dimensions, material type, application. The meaning of attributes is actually fairly dependent on the product type itself. Style means something very different in light bulbs than it does in something like an indexable cutting tool holder or a set of safety glasses.
Very true.
Because you have those variances, setting them up as global can create problems because different people will start to interpret them different ways. We'll take a look at an example of that later. On the other hand, you have some attributes that are so specific to individual product types that they really become irrelevant to 90% of your selection. So flow rate at 20 feet of head, right? This is an attribute that's very meaningful for pumps because it defines how much fluid can get pumped out of the pump if you're pumping it up 20 feet. That really doesn't apply to things like welding gloves or socket head cap screws. So if you set that up as a global attribute, you're essentially setting yourself up to have an attribute that is available but not relevant for 95% of your selection. And the last bucket that we see for bad global attributes are what we refer to as either-or attributes. So particularly in sort of like the industrial B2B space, there are some attributes that, depending on the product type, are talked about in different ways. So finish and color are two examples. Finish is something that you see used when the product is made out of some sort of metal that gets some kind of surface treatment. So plumbing fixtures, door hardware, where it's either a bright brass or a polished chrome or a brushed stainless steel. Now that is a use for finish. Color, on the other hand, is what you use when you're talking about something that doesn't have that sort of surface treatment feature, or it's not made out of metal. So the color of things like safety goggles or a vest, where it needs to be red, yellow, pink, orange, that's what color is used for. If you set up finish and color as two global attributes, you will start to see your suppliers or your users start to cross-pollinate values. They're going to put things like polished chrome in color. They're going to put things like red in finish. And it starts the data that you're trying to use to create a differentiated customer experience starts to get a little sloppy. So let's look at an example of that real quick. And one of my favorite examples of bad data is Amazon Business. And I can say this with tongue in cheek because I was here working at Amazon when we set this up. So one of the things that we set up as a global attribute for the cutting tools category was a faceted search, a global attribute for material type. And it was intended to be the attribute that was going to describe the substrate of the cutting tool. What is the tool made out of? Is it high-speed steel, cobalt steel, solid carbide? And when we were first loading products, that's what it was for. But now what you can see here is there's starting to get to be some other values, things like metal, stainless steel, steel. What's happening is that as more sellers have started to load products, they're using it as not as a definition of the substrate, but as a definition of what is this tool designed to cut. So you have one attribute because it's set up as global and it's not well defined, is starting to attract a lot of junk. And to that point, now when you go in and look at the see more to see all the different values, I mean, you're starting to see a lot of questionable ones like these. Cobalt, iron, and metal. Yeah, these are probably examples of things that cutting tools are designed to cut. But there's a lot more examples here of things that cutting tools in an industrial application is not meaningful. Things like cloth, leather, cotton. I mean, this is clearly a case where this attribute, because it's set up as global and not well structured, is starting to get a lot of junk into it. So this is the sort of stuff you want to try to avoid.
Yeah, and there's a whole second page of values available for the people shopping, which is unbelievable. That's going to keep people very busy. So how can we manage our global attributes? So let's look at some best practices. Number one, you don't want to default to global. You want to start all your attributes as category-specific attributes, and then let the data tell you when it's appropriate to convert to a global attribute.
And if the best case fill rate isn't at least 90%, it's not global. Best case fill rate is sort of in a perfect world, where I think every one of my suppliers is going to be able to populate every single value that's relevant to their products. Well, if you look at an attribute that you've set up as global, and you think that more than 10% of your selection, it can't be populated at all, that's probably a sign it shouldn't be global.
Very, very true. And then we also want to make sure that the attributes are identified and differentiated by their meaning, not their spelling. There's so many attributes that have a similar word or label, but they mean entirely different things. A really great example of this is connection type. In some applications, connection type is going to be focused on communication. So you're connecting by the Ethernet or some other version of a communication connection. And then it could also mean physical connection, like a socket or a screw-on or a snap-on to connect two physical entities to each other. So this is a really great example of how connection type or how the meaning of an attribute can be very different depending on the product group.
So what do we need to do to get started, Chantal?
All right, so our next step, the first thing you want to do is review your global attributes and see if they meet those requirements that we had just discussed. If they don't meet those requirements, then we would suggest converting them from global to category attributes, and vice versa if the requirements are met.
And if you don't have any global attributes today, then make sure you're using a grassroots effort. Start in your terminal nodes and look for attributes that are commonly used in the same way and promote them up incrementally. That's going to be a safer approach than dictating it. And lastly, take advantage of the business rules that you may have around global attributes, because global attributes apply to everything. You need them to be automated.
Very true. So thank you very much for joining us. This was episode 5 in our Power Product Data series. We hope to see you next time for our final episode, how taxonomy design can make or break the browsing experience, coming up on December 5th. So please join us.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in 3 weeks.
Thank you very much.